one of the things you wrote was basically 5 posts that were all lessons from Keith Rabois. Is there an origin story there? Was that at this point you had worked for years and you wanted to distill this down? What was the origin there and what were you hoping to encapsulate or be able to share?
Yeah, so I originally started working with Keith more directly. So he had been an angel investor in my first company that we ultimately ended up failing and selling to one of our clients. And then I was on the Teespring executive team where he was on the board, and then eventually became his sort of chief of staff at Khosla Ventures and worked very, very closely with him at that point, 8 to 10 hours a day. And over the course of 2 years, I sort of became more effective for Keith as I started to realize that the way that he would guide various founders and entrepreneurs was more of a science than it was an art. And that the best way that I could provide leverage for his time was actually starting to basically replicate him in certain scenarios by just applying those scientific methodologies to founders and fixing their problems before they would ever have to go to Keith. And I realized basically after 2 years when we were switching venture firms from Khosla Ventures to Founders Fund, I had a little bit of time off, and I realized I was like, one, I think it would be well appreciated by the public, but two, would also provide me a lot of leverage if I just wrote down this science where it's God, I'd spent so much time helping 3 or 4 companies in a row, helping prepare for board meetings. And I was I'm doing the same thing every time. I could write this into a really good guide. And I just quickly Googled around to see if anybody had made good guides. There's some stuff online that's oh, here's a slide deck template, etc. But it's never as comprehensive as I wanted of the actual philosophy of the template and the framework. And then, yes, also the slides are relevant, but how to think about how to make the slides is the much more important part. And so I kind of came up with just a set of ideas. I've had some time off between the 2 firms, and I was like, Keith, I think I could distill this stuff into a science and write it out. What do you think of these various lessons? And certain lessons from him were ones that he had already very clearly articulated into a framework. So for example, I think it's lesson 3 or something like that is how to be an effective executive. That was actually just entirely based off of a management presentation that he used to do at Square on a regular basis once a quarter for new managers. And so what I asked him to do was there was one time where a portfolio company asked him to give that Square management presentation, but basically to their managers. And I basically just recorded it, turned it into an essay, etc. Versus there were other ones where how to make an effective board meeting and build an effective board. Keith had never really thought about how to distill it into a science. He just had a lot of instincts. And so I actually had to in some ways extract it from him / I had to kind of build the framework myself and then run it by him, and then he'd give me some feedback, be ooh, you got some things right, but some things wrong. And so there's some of them that I would say are these are 95% just me parroting some of Keith's ideas. And there were some where it was man, some of these were weeks of deep work of figuring out how to take all these patterns that I've seen over the past 2 years and distill them into a simpler to understand framework. Maybe the other one being how to interview executives effectively. I had sat in on Keith had interviewed probably 30 CFOs, 30 VPs of E's, 30 VPs of sales over the course of the 2 years that I'd worked with him. And I was there's actually a pattern, and this is objectively, in my opinion, the best way to interview an executive after seeing him do it over and over. And again, it was one of those things where I had to explain, Keith, is this what you're doing when you're interviewing executives? Is this the framework? And then he'd sit there for a little bit and be huh. I'd never thought about it, but yes, that is my framework, but I'd never really explicitly thought about it. I just did it off of instinct or habit in some ways. Those original essays actually were what made my at least media profile, Twitter profile, etc., go viral. I've been meaning to at some point re-highlight them now that I've got a little bit of a larger presence, since when Varda was building its first board deck, the first thing I did was I don't remember the lesson. It's been 2 years since I wrote that essay, and it took a lot of effort. And so I pulled it back up and I was wow, this is a really good guide. I'm going to use these slides, and I'm going to make sure the Varda board slides follow this too. And now literally every Founders Fund portfolio company that Keith or I, or honestly most of the portfolios involved in, all the board decks literally just look the exact same and all follow this exact same structure. And it's great because they're all really good board decks, and they end up being really effective board meetings because of that.